40 feet above the Po Valley floor, an A-20 Havoc, trailing smoke from its right engine, held course toward a line of dispersed aircraft. Airspeed read 190 miles per hour. Fuel gauges showed 11 minutes of flight time remaining. Ground fire had already punctured the fuselage in 9 places. The German gunners had every angle calculated, and still the aircraft refused to climb away. At that altitude, with that damage, mathematics offered no path home. The morning of April 24, 1945, broke cold and gray over northern Italy. Low clouds hung at 2,000 feet across the Po Valley, pressing visibility down to 3 miles in scattered rain. The kind of weather that grounded most operations, the kind that made low-level attack runs exponentially more dangerous. But the war in Italy had entered its final, desperate phase. German forces were retreating north in disarray, attempting to salvage whatever aircraft, vehicles, and equipment they could move across the Po River before Allied forces cut off their escape routes entirely. Every functioning Luftwaffe aircraft that reached Austria represented future resistance. Every ammunition depot left intact meant more casualties for advancing ground troops. The 350th Fighter Group, operating A-20 Havocs out of Pisa, had been tasked with interdiction, destroying enemy aircraft on the ground, disrupting supply lines, and preventing the orderly withdrawal of German air assets. First Lieutenant Raymond L. had already flown one mission that morning. He had taken off at 06:30 hours as part of a 4-ship flight targeting German positions near Bergamo. The mission had gone according to plan. Targets hit, no losses, all aircraft recovered. Standard work for an experienced attack pilot. But intelligence reports filtering back to Pisa indicated that German aircraft were still dispersing to satellite fields across the valley. Reconnaissance photographs showed Ju-88s, Bf-109s, and various transport aircraft scattered in revetments and along tree lines at multiple locations. The Luftwaffe was trying to save what it could. Knight volunteered for the second mission of the day. This was not unusual for him. Volunteering was simply what he did. The briefing identified 3 priority targets: Ghedi Airfield, Villafranca Airfield, and Bergamo Airfield. All 3 were known to have active flak defenses. All 3 contained confirmed enemy aircraft. The mission profile called for low-level passes at minimum altitude to maximize accuracy with the A-20's forward-firing armament and internal bomb load. Low-level meant 50 feet or less. At that altitude, an A-20 Havoc presented a fast-moving but predictable target. The aircraft's twin Wright R-2600 engines produced 1,600 horsepower each, capable of pushing the bomber to 300 miles per hour in level flight. But at attack speed, with bomb bay doors open and the pilot focused on target acquisition, airspeed typically dropped to 200 miles per hour or below. 200 miles per hour across defended airspace meant approximately 3 seconds of exposure per gun position. 3 seconds was enough. The A-20 was not designed for sustained combat over defended targets. It was a medium attack bomber, fast, maneuverable for its class, but lacking the armor protection of dedicated ground attack aircraft. The cockpit glazing was vulnerable. The fuel tanks, while self-sealing, could not survive concentrated fire. The engines, mounted on the wings, were exposed to ground fire from multiple angles. One well-placed 20-millimeter round could end everything. Knight understood these limitations. Every A-20 pilot understood them. The question was never whether the aircraft could survive a single pass. It was whether the pilot could make that single pass count, hitting the target, breaking away, and getting out before the guns found their range. Multiple passes were doctrinally discouraged. The mathematics were simple. Each subsequent run gave the gunners more time to adjust, more data on the aircraft's approach angle, more opportunity to saturate the airspace with fire. One pass, one chance, then egress. That was the rule. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. Raymond Loran Knight was born on October 18, 1921, in Houston, Texas. He grew up in an era when aviation still carried the romance of barnstormers and record breakers, when names like Lindbergh and Earhart occupied newspaper headlines and boys built model aircraft from balsa wood and dope. But Knight's path to the cockpit was not driven by glamour or adventure-seeking. It was methodical. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1942, part of the massive expansion program that would transform American air power from a modest force into the largest aerial armada in history. His initial training took place in the standard pipeline: primary flight training, basic training, advanced training, the systematic process that turned civilians into military aviators. Knight proved to be a capable student, but not a flashy one. His instructors noted competence rather than brilliance. He followed procedures. He absorbed corrections without argument. He demonstrated the kind of steady, unspectacular performance that got pilots through training without incident, but rarely attracted special attention. This was not a limitation. It was a survival characteristic. The pilots who attracted attention in training, the ones who pushed limits, demonstrated exceptional aggressiveness, or stood out for natural talent, often faced different challenges in combat. Aggressiveness without discipline led to tactical errors. Natural talent without systematic thinking led to improvisation in situations that demanded procedure. Knight was procedure. He was assigned to the 346th Fighter Squadron of the 350th Fighter Group in the Mediterranean Theater. The unit operated P-39 Airacobras initially, then transitioned to P-47 Thunderbolts, and finally to A-20 Havocs for the ground attack mission that dominated the Italian campaign's final months. The A-20 assignment was significant. Flying a twin-engine attack bomber required different skills than single-seat fighter operations. The aircraft was heavier, less maneuverable, and demanded more planning for each mission. Pilots had to think in terms of bomb loads, fuel consumption, and attack geometry rather than pure dogfighting instinct. Knight adapted well. His squadron mates described him as quiet. Not withdrawn, he participated in the normal routines of squadron life, but he did not seek the spotlight. He did not tell dramatic stories about his missions. He did not embellish or exaggerate. He flew, he returned, he prepared for the next mission. By April 1945, Knight had accumulated significant combat experience. The exact number of missions varied in different accounts, but he had proven himself reliable under fire. He understood the A-20's capabilities and limitations. He knew how to approach defended targets, how to time his runs, how to maximize the effectiveness of his forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns and his bomb load. More importantly, he understood when to break off. The difference between experienced attack pilots and those who did not survive was often the ability to recognize the moment when continued engagement became suicide rather than calculated risk. Experienced pilots developed an internal calculus, a sense of when the target was achievable and when the defenses had won. Knight had demonstrated this judgment repeatedly. He was not reckless. He did not take unnecessary chances. He completed his missions and brought his aircraft home. This pattern made April 24 different. Something shifted in Knight's calculations that day, something in the intelligence reports, the urgency of the tactical situation, or his own assessment of what was required. The man who had always known when to break off was about to discover how far he was willing to go when breaking off was no longer enough. The 350th Fighter Group's operational rhythm in April 1945 reflected the accelerating collapse of German resistance in Italy. Missions launched at first light recovered by mid-morning and often launched again by early afternoon. The pace was relentless but purposeful. Every destroyed aircraft on the ground was one that could not interfere with Allied operations, one that could not escape to continue the fight elsewhere. Knight's approach to this tempo was systematic. He studied the intelligence reports carefully before each mission. He examined reconnaissance photographs when available, noting the positions of revetments, the likely locations of flak positions, the terrain features that might provide cover during approach or egress. This was not heroism. It was professionalism. The pilots who survived multiple tours in attack aviation shared certain characteristics. They planned meticulously, they executed precisely, and they recognized the limits of what their aircraft could accomplish against specific defenses. Knight's previous missions demonstrated this pattern. On earlier strikes against airfield targets, he had made his runs at maximum speed consistent with accurate weapons delivery. He had used terrain masking when available, approaching targets from unexpected angles, using tree lines and buildings to screen his approach until the final moments before weapons release. He had taken damage before. All attack pilots did. The A-20's aluminum skin showed the marks of previous encounters: patches over bullet holes, replaced panels, repaired control surfaces. This was normal. The aircraft was designed to absorb some punishment and keep flying. But Knight had never pushed beyond the boundaries of sustainable risk. When flak concentrations proved heavier than expected, he had adjusted his approach. When targets proved too well defended for a single pass to be effective, he had reported the situation accurately and let planners determine whether follow-up strikes were necessary. This was the correct response. Doctrine existed because it worked. Single passes against defended targets minimized exposure. Egress routes were planned to avoid known flak concentrations. Formation discipline maintained mutual support and complicated the gunners' tracking solutions. Knight followed these principles because they kept pilots alive. His flight log from the weeks preceding April 24th showed consistent performance. Targets hit, missions completed, aircraft recovered. Nothing exceptional, nothing that would have predicted what was coming. But combat sometimes reveals capacities that peacetime performance cannot measure. The pilot who had always calculated risk carefully was about to encounter a situation where calculation led to a different conclusion than doctrine prescribed. Sometimes the mathematics said that one pass was not enough. Sometimes the mathematics said that breaking off meant failure. And sometimes a pilot decided that failure was not acceptable, regardless of what the mathematics said about survival. The second mission launched from Pisa in the early afternoon. Knight led a flight of A-20s toward the first target, Ghedi airfield, approximately 150 miles to the northeast. The weather had not improved. Ceiling still low, visibility still marginal, the kind of conditions that compressed the tactical problem into an even smaller envelope. Low clouds meant low approaches. Low approaches meant more exposure to light flak. The flight proceeded northeast at cruise altitude, staying below the cloud base, navigating by terrain features visible through the haze. The Po Valley spread out beneath them, flat agricultural land crisscrossed by roads and irrigation channels, punctuated by villages and the occasional industrial facility. Somewhere ahead, German gunners waited. The approach to Ghedi began normally. Knight brought his flight down to attack altitude 50 feet or less and accelerated toward the airfield perimeter. Intelligence had indicated dispersed aircraft in revetments along the field's northern edge. The flak opened up at 800 yards. Light automatic weapons, 20 mm and 37 mm, created a lattice of tracers across the approach path. The sound reached the cockpit as a series of sharp cracks, the supersonic rounds passing close enough to be heard over engine noise. Knight held course. His forward guns opened up, the 650 caliber machine guns creating their own stream of fire toward the target area. At 200 miles per hour, the closure rate gave him approximately 12 seconds from initial engagement to overflight, 12 seconds of mutual destruction opportunity. The first pass caught a German aircraft in its revetment, an FW-1D-90 based on the silhouette. Knight's fire walked across the dispersal area, and the aircraft began to burn. He pulled up over the field boundary, banking hard left to avoid a church steeple that appeared in his flight path, and began his egress. Standard procedure said, "Mission accomplished, return to base." But Knight could see more aircraft, scattered along the tree lines, hidden in improvised positions that the reconnaissance photographs had not revealed. The Luftwaffe was dispersing everything it could save, and Ghedi held more targets than a single pass could address. He came around for a second run. The gunners were ready this time. They had his speed, his altitude, his approach angle. The 20mm fire concentrated on his probable flight path, creating a wall of steel that he would have to fly through to reach the remaining aircraft. Knight flew through it. His A-20 shuddered as rounds struck the fuselage. Something in the right wing made a sound like tearing metal. But the aircraft held together, and his guns found another target, this time a Ju-88 medium bomber that had been positioned under camouflage netting. The bomber burned. Second pass complete. Damage assessed. Right wing punctured. Fuel leak beginning, but engines still running. Doctrine said, "Enough. Return to base." Knight's fuel state was becoming a constraint. The leak was accelerating consumption. The distance back to Pisa represented a calculation that grew more unfavorable with each passing minute. But there were more targets. Villafranca airfield lay to the east. Intelligence had confirmed additional aircraft there, and the mission briefing had identified multiple objectives for exactly this reason. The destruction of every available German aircraft was the priority. Knight turned toward Villafranca. This decision marked the point of no return. He was now flying a damaged aircraft, leaking fuel, toward a second defended target, having already absorbed fire that would have justified immediate return to base under any reasonable interpretation of operational guidelines. The flight continued east. Villafranca airfield presented a different tactical problem. The defenses here were heavier. Multiple flak positions arranged to create overlapping fields of fire, the gunners presumably alerted by radio traffic from Ghedi that American attack aircraft were operating in the area. Knight approached from the southwest, using a line of trees to mask his final run-in. The flak found him anyway. At 400 yards, the fire became concentrated. Knight could feel the impacts now, not just hear them, as 20mm rounds punched through the aircraft's skin and struck structural members. The right engine began trailing smoke, but he held course. His targets were visible, 3 aircraft, appearing to be fighters, positioned in a dispersal area east of the main runway. They were partially concealed, but Knight's low altitude gave him the angle to see through the camouflage. He opened fire. The A-20's guns raked across the dispersal area. One aircraft, the fuel tanks ruptured, began to burn immediately. The others showed damage, though whether they were destroyed or merely disabled was impossible to confirm from his position. Knight pulled up over the airfield boundary. His right engine was now running rough. The fire had damaged something critical, perhaps a fuel line, perhaps a cylinder, and the power output was diminishing. The aircraft wanted to yaw right, and he was fighting the rudder to maintain coordinated flight. Fuel gauges showed the leak had accelerated. His reserves were draining faster than planned consumption would have predicted. The mission was complete by any reasonable standard. 2 airfields struck. Multiple enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged. The flight had accomplished its objectives, but Knight knew there was a third target. Bergamo airfield lay to the north. He had struck it that morning on the first mission. Intelligence suggested additional aircraft had dispersed there since. His aircraft was damaged. His fuel was critical. His right engine was failing. The return to Pisa was already marginal. Bergamo would make it impossible. Knight turned north. This decision defied every principle of attack aviation. A damaged aircraft, leaking fuel, one engine failing, pilot already fatigued from sustained combat. This combination did not produce successful outcomes. It produced aircraft losses and pilot casualties. The radio traffic that followed became part of the historical record, though the exact words varied in different accounts. German ground controllers monitoring American frequencies would have tracked the A-20's continued operation. The aircraft was not behaving according to the patterns they expected. American attack aircraft did not make repeated passes against defended targets. They did not continue missions with visible damage. They did not press attacks when every observable indicator suggested the pilot should be withdrawing. Yet this aircraft was not breaking off. It was turning toward another target, the Luftwaffe. Ground personnel at Bergamo would have received warning of the incoming attack. They would have seen the aircraft before. It had struck them that morning. Now it was returning, trailing smoke, clearly damaged, clearly operating beyond normal parameters, and still approaching. The approach to Bergamo tested the limits of what the A-20 could physically accomplish. Knight's right engine was now producing perhaps 60% power. The fuel leak had reduced his remaining flight time to minutes rather than the hour he would have needed for a comfortable return. The airframe had absorbed multiple hits, and the control surfaces were responding sluggishly. He came in at 40 feet. At this altitude, in this condition, the attack run was as much a controlled crash as it was a tactical maneuver. Knight was trading every margin of safety for weapons delivery accuracy. The German gunners at Bergamo had time to prepare. They had received warning of the incoming aircraft. They had adjusted their positions. They were ready. The fire that greeted Knight's approach was described in after-action reports as intense. The 20 mm and 37 mm positions opened up at maximum range, creating a continuous stream of tracers that filled the airspace between the A-20 and its targets. The probability of an aircraft surviving multiple passes through this fire was extremely low. Knight made his first pass. His remaining guns, some had been damaged in the earlier attacks, found targets in the dispersal areas. Aircraft burned, ammunition stores exploded. The concentrated fire of a low-level attack run created secondary detonations that spread across the airfield. He pulled up, barely clearing a hangar structure, and the aircraft shuddered under additional impacts. His right engine failed completely. The propeller windmilled uselessly, creating drag that pulled the aircraft to the right. Knight now had one engine, minimal fuel, an airframe that was approaching structural limits, and a target that had not been fully suppressed. Doctrine said, "Emergency egress. Attempt forced landing if return to base impossible." Knight came around for another pass. The German gunners tracking this aircraft would have registered something like confusion. The mathematics of the situation were clear to them as well. This aircraft could not survive continued engagement. It was damaged beyond reasonable operational limits. The pilot was either insane or conducting a deliberate sacrifice. Yet the aircraft was turning back toward them. Knight's final approaches to Bergamo, the exact number of passes varies in different accounts, but multiple runs are confirmed, demonstrated something beyond tactical calculation. He was flying an aircraft that could not complete its mission and survive. He had accepted that outcome. The question was not whether he would return to base. The question was how much damage he could inflict before the aircraft became unflyable. His guns found additional targets: dispersed aircraft in revetments, vehicles on access roads, positions that had escaped the morning's attack. The damage to Bergamo was substantial. Post-mission reconnaissance confirmed multiple aircraft destroyed, facilities damaged, and ground personnel casualties that disrupted the airfields operations during a critical phase of the German withdrawal. Knight's aircraft, by this point, was barely flying. The right engine was dead. The left engine was damaged and losing power. Fuel was exhausted, or nearly so. The airframe had absorbed damage that made sustained flight increasingly doubtful. He turned south toward friendly lines. The distance to Pisa was roughly 120 miles. The distance to the nearest Allied-held territory was significantly less. Knight would have known that reaching Pisa was impossible. His only option was to find suitable terrain for a forced landing before the aircraft became completely uncontrollable. He crossed the Allied lines approximately 15 minutes after his final pass over Bergamo. The aircraft was at very low altitude, single engine, barely maintaining flying speed. Knight had options at this point. He could have attempted to bail out, using his parachute to reach the ground safely while the aircraft crashed. Could have looked for an open field suitable for a wheels-up landing. What happened next remains partially unclear in the historical record. The aircraft went down in Allied-held territory in northern Italy. The circumstances, whether Knight attempted a landing that failed, whether the aircraft became uncontrollable, whether some final mechanical failure occurred, are not definitively established. First Lieutenant Raymond L. Knight died on April 25, 1945. He was 23 years old. The Medal of Honor citation for Raymond L. Knight was approved on September 2, 1946, more than a year after his death. The language is military bureaucratic, designed to document specific actions that meet the statutory requirements for the nation's highest award for valor. It does not capture the physical experience of flying a disintegrating aircraft into concentrated ground fire. It does not convey the progressive failure of systems, the narrowing of options, the accumulating certainty that survival had become impossible. The citation describes repeated attacks against heavily defended targets. It documents the destruction of numerous enemy aircraft. It notes that Knight continued his mission despite damage that should have compelled withdrawal. What it does not capture is the silence in the cockpit when the calculations resolved to zero. The moment when a pilot understands that the fuel gauges and the damage assessment and the distance to safety have combined into an answer that does not include going home. Knight's actions on April 24-25, 1945, represented something that defied the survival logic that governed attack aviation. He violated doctrine not from ignorance, but from knowledge, understanding precisely what the repeated passes would cost and accepting that cost as the price of mission completion. The German forces he attacked were in the final days of a lost war. The aircraft he destroyed would never have altered the outcome of the conflict. The airfields he struck would have been captured by Allied ground forces within weeks or days. None of this made the tactical problem smaller for the American troops advancing through northern Italy. Every destroyed aircraft was one that could not strafe their positions. Every disrupted airfield was one that could not support the organized resistance that prolonged combat and cost lives. Knight's decisions fit within this logic. He did not seek glory. His pre-war life and military service suggested nothing of the dramatic or attention-seeking personality that might court spectacular actions for their own sake. He was quiet, methodical, consistent. What he demonstrated on April 24th was not the abandonment of his methodology, It was the application of his methodology to a situation where the calculations produced a different answer than the usual one. Sometimes one pass was not enough. Sometimes breaking off meant leaving the job undone. And sometimes a pilot who had spent his career knowing when to break off discovered that he also knew when not to. The Medal of Honor recognized his actions as exceptional. They were, but they were not exceptional in the sense of being random or inexplicable. They emerged from a particular combination of tactical circumstances, individual character, and the moral weight that some pilots placed on mission completion. Knight's posthumous recognition included having facilities and programs named in his honor. His story became part of the institutional memory of Army, Air Force's sacrifice in World War II. But the monument that matters most cannot be captured in bronze or official language. It exists in the understanding of what low-level attack aviation actually required, not the sanitized version of guns blazing and explosions flowering, but the reality of aluminum and fuel and human tissue passing through volumes of air filled with supersonic steel. Knight flew that reality to its conclusion. He did not survive it, but he completed the mission. And in the strange algebra of combat, where survival and success sometimes occupy opposite ends of the same equation, Raymond Knight found an answer that honored both his training and something deeper than training can teach. The aircraft that would not break off has been silent for 8 decades now. What remains is the question it asked of everyone who studies aerial combat. What would you accept to finish what you started?